short time ago, the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court overturned Bill Cosby's sexual assault conviction. He was found guilty in 2018 of 3 counts of sex crimes and sentenced to 10 years behind bars.
The statement from the Cosby family from this attorney, Andrew Wyatt, says, "I want to thank the Supreme Court who saw the light and saw the truth. Mr. Cosby was originally given a deal by Bruce Castor in which he was granted immunity. He gave up his Fifth Amendment rights in hopes that he would get back to work, back to life, and he always showed up for any legal matters and questions on his own accord. Charges should have never been brought against Mr. Cosby. I want to thank the attorneys who successfully argued his appeal, and especially Mrs. Cosby, who stood strong and was here for Mr. Cosby every step of the way and supported every idea and strategy from the attorneys and the team, and she always knew that Mr. Cosby was innocent." So that's really honestly the crux of it. Essentially, the appellate court deciding that this deal that was made with the then Montgomery County District Attorney Bruce Castor, who may be a familiar name to you, Allison, because he represented President Trump after the insurrection. Essentially, that happened back in 2005 with Cosby, which allowed Cosby then to feel like he had immunity to then go forward and give these depositions where he incriminated himself. And then those depositions were then used against him when charges were basically brought forward more than a decade later. And that's what the appellate court is saying, was his due process was violated. So this is really just stunning at the moment. But what we are hearing is this 78-year-old or 80, he's in his 80s, 83,
he's
thank
83,
you,
yeah.
83-year-old comedian who many thought that he would be in prison for the rest of his life is now going to be walking as a free man, when we know during these court trials more than 50 women were coming forward. And you have to remember, again, to put this in context, this was the first celebrity in the Me Too movement that was accused and also convicted. This was like a pivotal moment in that movement to sort of pave the way. Of course, we saw Harvey Weinstein after that and many others. And so this was huge for women to say they can come forward and actually get justice. And now it looks like that's all somewhat in question as to how much justice did they really get.
Absolutely. I've interviewed close to a dozen of those women personally. I've spoken to some today already, and they are devastated by this. I mean, they took the risk of coming forward and telling these hideous stories about what they say he did, and now that his conviction has been overturned. So that feels like justice denied to them.
Breaking news about Bill Cosby. The comedian was just released from prison after the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned the 83-year-old actor's sex assault conviction. Cosby served more than 2 years of a 3 to 10-year sentence, convicted of drugging and molesting Temple University employee Andrea Constand.
The court says the facts are very straightforward, that when the victim initially came forward, the district attorney decided not to file charges, that there were too many problems with the evidence, and that he publicly made a statement that he would not pursue these charges, and that he did so in order to free up the possibility that Cosby could be forced to testify in a civil trial that she filed against him later, and that he could not in that civil trial then invoke his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, because he was told by the district attorney and believed the advice of his own lawyers that anything he said in the civil trial could not be used against him in the criminal trial if the state tried it again. So he did testify, he did incriminate himself, he said things that were incriminating in the civil trial. And then the district, the state of Pennsylvania came back and charged him with the crime. What the Supreme Court said today is, you can't do that. You gave him a reason to believe that he could testify at the civil trial without putting himself in jeopardy of the criminal prosecution. The Pennsylvania court said, our sense of fair play and decency compels us to believe that the district attorney had to stand by the decision that was made by a predecessor in the office not to charge. So that's the reasoning of the court. The outcome, Lester, is that he cannot be tried again on these charges. That means that the woman at the center of this case, she can't be the subject of another criminal prosecution. This one is over. Now, that doesn't mean that other victims could come forward and the state could investigate and decide whether or not to pursue criminal charges based on entirely different facts, but there can't be a retrial on this case.
We know that there are other women who testified of what they thought was similar behavior against them. There's a statute of limitations issue. Would that prevent some of these cases from going forward?
Potentially, and the court doesn't explicitly says here that they're not making any decision about any other potential case or any of the testimony that was offered in the civil trial. They simply say that issue isn't before us and we're not going to answer it.
You see pictures there of the more than 20 women that I interviewed years ago for a Dateline special. Those are all women who made various different allegations against Bill Cosby. So some of them I'm reaching back to today, and they're saying things like, oh my God, what is happening? I can't process this. They are stunned by this legal decision. The women themselves weren't expecting the appeal to go anywhere. They understood that there was an appeal being made, but those women, not being lawyers, thought that it wouldn't lead to any kind of overturning of this conviction. I can read you a couple of comments that I've gotten. One from Eden Turrell. She's one of the accusers of Bill Cosby. She says to me, I'm just finding it here. From the beginning, the rigid constructs of the statute of limitations did not provide protection or a pathway of justice for the women that came out against Cosby. The outdated laws are clearly in place, protecting men in these cases more often than not. This is the story of the Me Too movement that must be included in the narrative now. That's Eden Turrell. Now, just to give you a sense of why she says that, I mean, you just touched on this with Pete Williams. Many of the women who came forward, we're talking about events that happened 20, 30 years ago, and by statute could no longer bring a criminal case or sometimes even a civil suit against Bill Cosby. So, as Pete just said, many of those who've made accusations aren't probably going to have a legal recourse. I'd be interested to know what the situation is in California now, because many of the statutes have changed, and in California they now, as I understand it, don't have the same statute of limitations that they had prior to the Me Too movement. So maybe that's a question for Danny Savalos. But what I can tell you is, again, I'm getting a lot of comments of, I'm sick to my stomach, I don't know how to process this. Having talked to these women for years, Lester, they say they went through traumatic events with Bill Cosby. They made allegations of everything from rape to sexual assault to harassment. They will now say that today is yet another traumatic event for them, seeing this reversed.
It would be very difficult because it appears that the court has ruled that all of this evidence is essentially precluded from being used against Bill Cosby. But as we've already mentioned, the statute of limitations has almost certainly passed for some of these older allegations. If there are newer allegations, they may fall within the statute. And the prosecution or the Commonwealth would not be precluded if they had separate independent facts to base that decision. So that is a prosecutorial decision that would depend on whether or not they have new evidence.
And the prosecution also has to look at how much time he's already served and what the likelihood of a conviction would be.
That's right. I mean, the decision to prosecute Cosby at this point, for especially if these are older allegations, is a very difficult one for the prosecution because they have to weigh that against the resources that they would expend in prosecuting Cosby against the possibility that he might either get acquitted or that these witnesses may not even be able to introduce these prior bad acts witnesses the way they were able to the first time around. The Supreme Court didn't reach that issue, but it is certainly not a sure thing that the prosecution would be able to march in all of these prior bad acts witnesses, and that's women who would testify that Cosby did similar things to them in the past.
Bill Cosby is now out of prison. This is an image taken from above, not just moments ago, of the 83-year-old actor getting out of his car at a home after being released from prison sometime in the last hour. Pennsylvania's highest court overturned his sexual assault conviction. The court said an agreement Cosby had with a previous prosecutor should have prevented him from being charged in the case. The 83-year-old has now served more than 2 years of a sentence that could have stretched up to 10 years. That was given back in 2018. He was convicted of drugging and molesting Andrea Constand, a Canadian, a Temple University employee, convicted of that at his suburban estate. And here we are seeing the actor being walked into his home. This just happening moments ago.
You're right. I mean, it caught really most legal observers by surprise. We knew that Cosby was appealing it. We knew he had a high-profile legal team, but there were a few people who thought this would be successful. The key part of the ruling by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court was that Cosby had been previously told by a prior prosecutor that he would not be charged. Now, Cosby claimed because of that promise, because of that assurance, he made comments that were later used against him in the court of law. So the court said, well, he was made this promise. He acted on this promise. He felt that the promise was legitimate. And then he made comments that were then used against him. It's a very complicated issue. The court did not, by any stretch of the imagination, say, no, Bill Cosby, you did not do this. The conviction, the guilty verdict was improper. They said that you just should not have been prosecuted to begin with. And because of that, Bill Cosby is a free man, released from prison just around a couple hours after the decision was announced by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And we'll see where he goes from here.
As you say, because of the nature of the ruling, it isn't likely to change the mind of Americans who believe that this man is guilty and belongs in jail.
Well, this has been going on really for more than a decade. There were whispers for a while. There were some allegations in the early 2000s that Cosby was possibly involved with giving women a type of drug that would knock them out, that would make them possibly targets for sexual assault. That's what he was found guilty of. Now, there were dozens and dozens of women who accused him, but because of statute of limitations laws, he just could not be prosecuted in most cases. Now, does this wipe the slate clean for Cosby? Probably not. And we should point out, even though he has a big, big legal victory today, I mean, he's out of prison, there are legal challenges possibly in the future. Unlikely he would be criminally charged because of the statute of limitations, but he could face civil lawsuits. There are a number of those pending against him. So Bill Cosby, his legal issues are certainly not over, but he is a free man.